Cool. Well, my name is Ben. Tonight we have a lot of people from Demon Free joining us. Hello, thank you for joining us. If you're super new to the Demon and you've never been to one of these classes before, the awesome thing about the Demon community, I'll call everybody here Demonites if that's okay. I don't know if that's a bad word, but they're super helpful. So you can just ask a question in the chat, and maybe before I even see it, they will answer it. We also have Abigail here tonight. I don't know if any, I don't know. I didn't see, oh, Christine, you're here too. Okay, cool. So they can help answer questions as well, technical or otherwise. So yeah, if you get lost, just ask questions. You can always raise your hand too, and I'll try to answer your question verbally. All right. Well, tonight we are going to cover parallel reasoning questions. In the Demon, we just call them parallel questions. You can break them up into 2 or even 3 types if you want to. I don't think it's necessary. There are parallel reasoning questions in which they give you a question that or an argument that may or may not be flawed. And then there are parallel flaw questions in which they've definitely given you a question that is flawed. And then there are these questions that throw in the word principle. Some people separate them out as a separate question type. We would just say they're parallel reasoning questions, and so you don't need to worry about them separately. And I think we'll see some of those tonight. But in any case, all of these questions are asking you to do the same thing, which is read an argument in logical reasoning. As always, you have to try to understand it, right? That's rule number 1 in the Demon. You really have no business going into the question or the answer choices until you understand the argument on your own terms, right? That's going to slow a lot of you down at first, but it's going to speed you up in the long run. Because if you can read and understand this argument like no other, like anyone can ask you questions about it and you understand it and you understand what's wrong with it, then you're ready for the discussion that will follow. In any case, you want to read and understand the argument, and then you want to decide for yourself whether you think that argument is good or bad. Okay. Now, most arguments on the LSAT are bad. And by bad, I mean the evidence that the author gives you in favor of her conclusion is not sufficient. In other words, those claims by themselves do not prove the conclusion, even if they support it, right? That's not good. So when you encounter an argument, you want to read it, you want to understand it, and then decide whether the evidence proves the conclusion. If it does, then it's a valid argument, it's a good argument, and then you're ready to go into the question, right? And if it says, which one of the following arguments is most similar in its flawed reasoning to the argument above, well, now you know that you missed something, right? Like you read the argument, you tried to understand it, you tried to decide whether it was a good or bad argument, and then you realize you thought it was good. And then the test is telling you that it's bad. So right there, you need to stop and you need to go back and you need to figure out why the argument is flawed, right? Okay, but alternative scenario. You read the argument, you understand it, you decide that it's flawed, and the test kind of confirms that by saying which one of the following arguments is most similar and it's flawed reasoning to the argument above. Now you're going into the answer choices and you're looking for another answer choice that's going to be on almost always on a different topic. The topic changes, but you're looking for an argument that exhibits or makes the same mistake. That's all you're looking for, right? And so it's crucial that you figure out what the author did, how the author messed up, because if you can get your mind focused on that, that is going to lead you to the correct answer. Now, in a parallel reasoning question, in which case our original argument is not necessarily flawed, and let's assume for a second that it's valid, well, in that case, you are looking for an argument that's using the same kind of reasoning, which means the way in which the author proved her conclusion is going to be the same way in which the author proved the correct answer is going to prove its conclusion. To give you an example, if I said to you, if I eat olives, then I'm going to cry. Are you guys cool with that? That's not actually true, but just bear with me here. So if I eat olives, then I'm going to cry, right? But I'm not capable of crying. It's just, I cannot cry. Well, if you know those two things, if you know that if I eat olives, then I'm definitely going to cry, and you know that I'm not capable of crying, then you can safely conclude that I will never eat olives. It's just not possible for me in this universe where if I eat olives, I will cry, and I am not capable of crying. So my argument might be, if I eat olives, then I'm going to cry. I can't cry. That's just not possible. Therefore, I'm never going to eat olives, or it's not possible for me to eat olives. It's just never going to happen. That argument had two premises, right? One was an if-then statement. If I eat olives, then I'm going to cry. There was another premise that was basically like, hey, I can't cry. And then there was a conclusion that was drawn on the basis of those two premises. If that's the argument you're given, then the correct answer is going to do something similar. It's almost certainly going to use some sort of if-then statement. It's then going to have a non-if-then statement that says, hey, you can't cry, but it's going to be something else, some other topic. And then the conclusion is also going to be a non-if-then statement, just saying, hey, you're not going to eat olives or whatever, right? So it's going to have a very similar structure. That's what we're looking for in parallel reasoning. The topic is going to be different, but the underlying structure of the argument, the way the author went about proving her conclusion, is going to be the same. Okay, that's a lot to throw at you, but bottom line, understand the argument, decide whether you think it's a good or bad one, and then read the question and look for an answer that has either the same flaw or the same underlying reasoning. Questions about any of that?
You were talking about how you named out like the premises, and then
Yep.
like you use that to help prove your conclusion. Should we also number the premises in our head? Like, okay, like they use this to support it, this to support it, this, and then look for a conclusion that does all of that. So like, let's say if they had three premises supporting their conclusion, we look for something like that, or no? It's a waste of time.
Well, so it's not always the case that if you have three premises in the original argument and you have a conclusion in the original argument, that you're going to have three premises in the correct answer and just one conclusion.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But so it's not as simple as that. At the same time, if any of, like, sometimes what they'll do is, let's imagine, for example, that I just told you, if I eat olives, then I'm going to cry. And then I told you I'm not going to cry. And then I threw in like a third premise. I'm like, oh, by the way, it's Friday. Right? Like just some random premise. And then I'm like, therefore, I'm never going to eat olives. It's just not possible. Well, that third premise that it's Friday doesn't help. It's not necessary to the reasoning, right? But they can throw in stuff like that. They can throw in background information, do whatever. And so the correct answer may have three premises, but it may ignore that unnecessary one. At its core, though, it's got to follow that same kind of reasoning. You can't like throw out one of those two premises, because you kind of needed both, right, to get to that conclusion. And if we're given a valid argument in the original passage, then that means the correct answer is also going to be valid.
All right, thank you.
Yep, no problem. Sean.
Yeah, hi Ben. I feel that when I get these questions wrong, it's usually because I'm trying to match the passage to a particular answer on the basis of like the order that the argument is in, or like the phrasing that it shares with it. And usually the mistake I make is like, oh, the reasoning was just different. But it's like, for example, one of these questions, there was like the passage had a specific situation, or like what seemed to be a specific situation. And the correct answer had like the reasoning was the same, but it was applied in like a general way. And I just picked one that was like, oh, the sort of the wording was the same, and it was also a specific situation. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what sort of similarities are we supposed to be looking out for? I know reasoning is the main one, but
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, that's exactly what they're essentially testing here, right? What is logically significant to the underlying reasoning, and what is not logically significant? And so in that case, specificity may be logically significant, right? It sounds like in your example that it wasn't. So in the correct answer that they gave you, it went to something general, and that didn't matter. But sometimes, especially if the conclusion is maybe making a mistake of going from something specific to a conclusion that's something general, then you might need to actually see that in the correct answer, right? So it's not like there's necessarily some hard and fast rules in terms of saying, oh, well, don't worry about things that are specific and then maybe change to general, because that could actually matter depending on the conclusion that's being drawn, right? If that's significant to the actual argument. It sounds like in your example, it wasn't. It's actually possible that it was, but that the answer you chose was more parallel than the wrong answer, right? So it mattered, but not as much as something else. There are some simple things to keep in mind. One, and I think this is obvious to anyone who's done a few of these, the subject matter does not matter, right? So if the original argument is about cows, the correct answer can be about astronauts. We don't care about that. The second thing that never matters is the order that these that the parts of the argument appear. So if you're, and this can be very tempting, you want to compare the first sentence in the original argument to the first sentence in the answer that you're looking at. But that doesn't matter at all. What you need to compare are the premises in the argument in the original to the premises in the answer choice, and they could have moved around, right? It's very common for them to put the conclusion first in the answer choices and the conclusion last in the original or in the middle. And so you just have to make sure you're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges, even if you're comparing the same location. I would say on some of the harder ones, they deliberately kind of, shake that up. It's nice when they leave it in the same order, because then people who don't realize that can just compare first sentence to first sentence. Some things that generally tend to be logically significant and that you need to take note of would be necessary or conditions that create sufficient or necessary conditions, which would include if-then statements, right? If-then statements are a core kind of reasoning. And so if I see an if-then statement in the original argument, I would expect the correct answer to also have some form of if-then statement. It may not be stated in if-then form, but you need something that's equivalent to that. So for example, if I say to you, all sedans are red, all sedans are red, that's the same as saying, if you're a sedan, then you're red, right? So a sentence doesn't necessarily have to literally use the words if and then, but it has to have the same impact. Now, one thing that people will do is that terms like some and most can be logically significant. And therefore, in some cases, they may look at answer choices and say, oh, well, this answer choice says some, and the original argument says some. Therefore, maybe these things are parallel. The only problem, and it's kind of a big problem, is that people become hyper-focused on those terms and kind of miss the forest from the trees, right? Like in some cases, whether the argument said some or most may actually not be that big of a deal to the overall conclusion, because the conclusion isn't really about quantities. And so getting hung up on the fact that the answer you're looking at doesn't use the same quantifier as the original can deter you from choosing the right answer. On the flip side, or at the same time, sometimes, the original argument might say likely, which means the same as usually or most. And people miss that they're essentially saying the same thing, and they go for an answer that also uses the word most, or maybe uses most in the conclusion, but the most was actually in one of the premises. So you really need to focus first on understanding the argument, 2, deciding whether you think it's good or bad, and then working from that basis first. And then if you get down to 2 answer choices, and I imagine this will happen tonight, then we might need to look a little more closely. We might be like, oh, wait, actually this conclusion, this one is a lot stronger than the original, and this one is using that same level of strength. Therefore, given the fact that fundamentally they're both the same, I'm going to go with this answer choice because it's more parallel. It's the most parallel answer, right? So I mean, we can talk about those things. The problem with talking about them too much is then people just start thinking about those, and that's it, right? And that's problematic. Eric.
Yeah, hey, you probably already answered this by just saying that the subject of the argument doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But I find that when I see an answer whose content most closely matches what was in the original, I just say, okay, that's not going to be it. If it's like corporate profits and then the answer is personal finance, like, okay, they're trying to trap me. That's not it. Is it dangerous to try to metagame it like that? Or is that generally true?
I would say it's probably generally true. It is generally true. When the topic is the same, it's often not correct, but there are definitely cases where it has been correct. And so you really, if you see an answer choice that's similar in content, you can say, okay, I realize this is probably one of those ones where they're trying to get people, but it could also be, this like trick on trick sort of thing, where they're like, realize some people are thinking that and it's actually right. And so you have to treat it for what it is, and that is content doesn't matter one way or another. So we're still going to look at the underlying reasoning.
Makes sense.
Cool. All right. Any other questions before we jump into these questions? I saw earlier some people were saying that they couldn't access the page. Is that right? Demon free folks? Is that still the case? I'm not hearing anything.
I could.
You could? Okay. Well, maybe we can drop, if you still can't access it, we'll drop the links to the exact questions in the chat too, if that's okay. Yeah, Joshua just dropped the class link. If you can't find that or you can't access it, let me know. All right, so let's go ahead and do this. Let's do the first 3 questions. So it looks like vegetarian, Mr. Tannisch, and keeping confidence. So good luck with those 3. I'll give you about 6 minutes or so, maybe 7, and then we'll talk about it. All righty. So that was 6-7 minutes. Christine, if you don't mind popping up the survey, that'd be great. Let me know which answer choices you all were tempted by. We'll start with that first question. Okay. What was the first question? Vegetarian. All right. What'd you guys think of these questions? Easy, hard? Okay. Got a thumbs up and kind of okay. We'll see. Medium. Oof. There's always a range. There's always a range. Doesn't matter. Let's give this a whirl. So test 65, section 1, question 6. Evan. All right, Evan, what do you have to tell us? I'm a vegetarian because I believe it is immoral to inflict pain on animals to obtain food. All right. So when I think of vegetarians, I think people can be vegetarian for a lot of reasons, including health reasons. But this guy seems to be motivated by this moral sense of, conscious beings, including animals. Some vegetarians who share this moral reason nonetheless consume some seafood on the grounds that it is not known whether certain sea creatures can experience pleasure or pain. Okay, so we have these other folks who agree with Evan, but look, we don't know what the seafood or what seafood or sea animals feel, so let's just go ahead and eat it. But if it is truly wrong to inflict needless suffering, we should extend the benefit of doubt to sea animals and refrain from eating seafood. Okay, I don't think this argument is actually horrible. I am kind of agreeing with Evan here. If you think that you shouldn't eat animals because it causes pain and you don't know whether it causes sea creatures pain, then you should probably wait, right? I mean, it's kind of convenient to be like, well, we don't know, so I'm just going to go ahead and eat it anyway. In any case, the underlying idea here is when in doubt, right? Err on the side of caution, maybe. Okay. Question 6, which one of the following most closely conforms to the principle illustrated by Evan's criticism of vegetarians who eat seafood? Okay, so the principle illustrated by this argument or Evan's criticism is what I just said, which is basically when you're not sure one way or another, you should err on the side of caution, right? You should maybe not eat the food until we know. So it's about when you don't know, what do you do? I expect this new argument to be probably about a totally different topic, but to say something similar. If you don't know what to do, err on the side of caution. So A, I do not know if I have repaid Farah the money she lent me for a movie ticket. Okay, so this is a good start. We're in a situation in which we don't know what happened. She says that she does not remember whether or not I repaid her. Okay, that doesn't add anything. We were talking about the number of premises earlier. It kind of says what we already know, which is we don't know. In any case, in order to be sure that I have repaid her, I will give her the money now. All right, this person is erring on the side of caution. I would definitely keep this answer open. It looks like it was by far the most popular answer, but we still have a lot of other answers that were still chosen. So let's take a look. B, it is uncertain whether all the owners of the defective vehicles know that their vehicles are being recalled by the manufacturer. Okay, so again, we're in this situation where we don't know. It's uncertain whether these folks know about their vehicles being recalled. Thus, we should expect that some vehicles that have been recalled have not been returned. That's probably true, but that's not. If you wanted to err on the side of caution, what would you do? I don't even know what you would do here. You would we don't know how many people we don't know how many people don't know. Therefore, how do you err on the side of caution? You help them. Anyways, this is about, the conclusion here is about expectations as opposed to about what you should do, right? It's almost like you should believe something versus you should do something. And in answer choice A, she said, hey, I don't know. So what am I going to do? I'm going to pay her the money. So in that sense, between A and B, A is better because the original was about action, not just about belief. Okay. All right, C, I'm opposed to using incentives such as reduced taxes to attract businesses to our region. This is already seeming odd. These incentives would attract businesses interested only in short-term profits. Such businesses would make our region's economy less stable because they have no long-term commitment to the community. All right, nothing in here is about, I don't know X, therefore we should play it safe and do Y, right? It's just, hey, here's what I am opposed to. I don't think we should do Y, but it doesn't say we don't know. So C is out because it's lacking that I don't know component. D, updating our computer security system could lead to new contracts. Okay, could. I guess that's kind of saying I don't know. The present system has no problems, but we could benefit from emphasizing a state-of-the-art system in new proposals. If we do not get new customers, the new system could be financed through higher fees for current customers. Okay, there's no sense of like, okay, I'm going to err on the side of caution. I should do X. It's just like, we could do this and we could do that and yada, yada. So this is not parallel. We don't know X, therefore we should do Y, which is the safe move. E, Isabel Allende, I don't know how to say that name, lived through the tragic events of her country's recent history. No doubt her novels have been inspired by her memories of those events. Okay, I'm already hating this answer, but yet her characters are hopeful and full of joy, indicating that her own view of life has not been negatively marked by her experiences. There's nothing in here about like, we don't know X, therefore we should do Y. So it's definitely A. Questions about that one? Okay, that's, at the end of the day, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for an underlying structure, right? And then trying to match that to the correct answer. And the 4 wrong answers here did not have that structure at all. All right, let's go to the next one. Question 11. Please vote. Let me know what you liked or didn't like. Okay, test 65, section 1, question 11. Inspector, the only fingerprints on the premises are those of the owner, Mr. Tannisch. Therefore, whoever now has his guests missing diamonds must have worn gloves. All right, there's actually a decent amount to unpack here. First of all, there are missing diamonds, right? Okay, so some diamonds have gone missing. They weren't Mr. Tannisch's, they were his guests, right? So he had a guest and that guest has lost some diamonds. There are only fingerprints on the premises from Mr. Tannisch. If I were told those 3 facts, I would kind of suspect that Mr. Tannisch has taken the diamonds, right? But instead, whoever now has his guest missing diamonds must have worn gloves. Well, that conclusion is assuming a couple things. One, that it wasn't Mr. Tannisch, right? It was someone else. It couldn't have been Mr. Tannisch. And 2, it's assuming that even if it was someone else who somehow hid the fingerprints, that they had to hide their fingerprints using gloves. Like, I've watched enough movies. I feel like people can like wipe them away, right? Isn't that a method? It's not a method I've ever used. I've never had the need to eradicate my fingerprints, but I imagine that that's a method. There's got to be at least one other method than wearing gloves. Yet this conclusion said, whoever now has his guest missing diamonds must have worn gloves. I just thought of another possibility. Maybe the guest has the missing diamonds, but doesn't realize that they're missing, right? Like We lose stuff all the time and then find it later. So this argument, needless to say, sucks, right? So if you read this argument and you were like, yeah, great, I get it. Well, that's nice, but you would also need to realize that it's horrible. Okay, so that's where we're trying to get. Question 11, which one of the following exhibits a flaw? Okay, good. The test is confirming what I just saw. In its reasoning, most similar to that in the inspector's reasoning. What is the flaw here? The flaw is, I would say, at least twofold. One, assuming that the owner could not have done this deed, even though his fingerprints are all over the place. And two, assuming that whoever did it had to hide it in this particular way with gloves. Okay. Answer choice A. The campers at Big Lake Camp, all of whom became ill this afternoon, have eaten food only from the camp cafeteria. Okay, so a bunch of people got sick and they only ate from the camp cafeteria. If you heard those two facts, you would probably say, well, damn, there must have been something bad about the food at that cafeteria. The conclusion, therefore, the cause of the illness must not have been something they ate. All right, that seems to be problem number one in the original argument. You give me evidence that makes me think X happened, and then you conclude that something other than X happened, like Y happened. Why are you doing that, right? It doesn't make sense. So you guys, it looks like this answer. I like it too. B, the second prototype did not perform as well in inclement weather as did the first prototype. Okay, so the second prototype is not as good as the first one. Hence, the production of the second prototype might have deviated from the design followed for the first. Yes, that seems like a reasonable possibility. Notice this conclusion is substantially better than the original because of what word? I don't want you guys to obsess about these things, but it's still, it makes a difference here. Eric writes might. Yeah, it's exactly right. Like it's way better to say, hey, I think this might have happened because of that, than to say it must have happened, right? You're really setting yourself up for failure when you do that, unless you have the evidence to back it up. But this argument actually has, I see no problem with it whatsoever. It's a valid argument. And the original was definitely flawed, so it cannot be parallel. C, each of the swimmers at this meet more often loses than wins. I'm already kind of like, where is this going? Therefore, it is unlikely that any of them will win. Well, actually, that's flawed, by the way. I don't know if you guys realize that, but that's a flawed argument. Each of the swimmers at this meet more often loses than wins. Okay, so if you look at each individual swimmer, they are less likely to, well, what happens? They lose more than they win. But does that mean that therefore it is unlikely that any of them will win? You only need one of them to win. It's very possible. In fact, right? Someone has to win. So this is it's just nonsensical. So this is flawed, but it's not flawed in the way that the original was flawed. So not parallel, it's wrong. D, all of Marjorie's cavities are on the left side of her mouth. Okay, I see this was the second most tempting answer. All of Marjorie's cavities are on the left side, hence she must chew more on the left than on the right. That actually kind of makes sense. If you have more cavities on the left, then you're probably chewing more on the left. Right, so I can see why this is the second most tempting answer, right? It's like they gave us evidence, but the evidence actually kind of flows into the conclusion, whereas in the original, they gave us evidence and it did not flow into the conclusion. The conclusion went in the opposite direction. So unfortunately, that's wrong. E, all of these tomato plants are twice as big as they were last year. Okay, again, I'm trying to see how this is related to the original. So if we grow peas, they will probably be twice as big as last year's peas. That's not a great argument. I don't know if what's true about tomatoes is also going to be true about peas, but that's a different flaw than the original. It's not like the evidence about the tomatoes goes against the conclusion about the peas. It just doesn't support it, right? The thing about the original argument was that the evidence went against the conclusion. Here, it's just not good evidence. Okay, so the answer is definitely A. Questions? The cool thing about parallel reasoning questions, and I'm sorry that I might drag out these explanations a little bit more than you may need to understand the correct answer, is that in parallel reasoning questions, right, they're giving you 6 arguments. So you have the opportunity to test your chops, your ability to see whether 6 arguments are good or bad. Right? A lot of times people can be like, oh yeah, I kind of see how that answer is parallel, but it's like, okay, can you see how the other arguments aren't flawed, or they are flawed, but they're flawed in a different way? It really pushes your ability to read and understand arguments and then decide whether they're good or bad. And those 2 skills, reading and understanding, and then 2, deciding whether the argument is valid or invalid, are the 2 most critical skills in logical reasoning. You get those 2 things down, you know, we can talk about question types and all that stuff, but that's your key to really boosting your score in logical reasoning. Everything else is icing on the cake. All right, let's go to the last one. Okay, this is test J, section 2, question 12. Suppose I have promised to keep a confidence. Keep a confidence, okay? And someone asks me a question that I cannot answer truthfully without thereby breaking the promise. All right, so this is LSAT being its kind of typical wordy self. When it says, I have promised to keep a confidence, I just think of it as, hey, I've promised to keep a secret. It looks like a lot of us got this one right. So assuming A is right, but given the fact that 86% of you have chosen that, I'm guessing it is. Let's hope it is, right? So I have promised to keep a confidence. So I've promised to keep a secret, and someone else asked me a question, in which case I'm going to have to somehow reveal that secret. Obviously, I cannot both keep and break the same promise. Okay, yeah, that does seem pretty obvious to me. Therefore, one cannot be obliged to both answer all questions truthfully and keep all promises. I actually think this argument is legit. If we have an example here of someone who will break or reveal a secret and thus break their promise if they answer a question truthfully. So yeah, it can't be true that you can both answer all questions in the universe truthfully and keep all promises. There's going to be at least one instance in which one of those things is violated, right? So this is a legit argument, I would say. Which one of the following arguments is most similar in its reasoning to the argument above? Now, here is the LSAT alluding to the fact that the original argument may be valid. It doesn't have to be, it could still be flawed, but they're not saying it's definitely flawed. And so we can kind of see that we're on the right path, right? It's like, oh, okay, I thought that argument was legit, and this question is leaving open the possibility that it could be legit. So I'm probably on the right path. A, it is claimed that we have the unencumbered right to say whatever we want. It is also claimed that we have the obligation to be civil to others, but civility requires that we not always say what we want. So we cannot both, it cannot be true both that we have the unencumbered right to say whatever we want and that we have the duty to be civil. Okay, so given how many people have chosen this answer, I'm assuming this is correct, but actually at first glance, I would be hesitant to pick it, because to me, a right and a duty are 2 different things. Like you could have the right to say whatever you want, but then also have the duty to shut up, right? Like to me, those aren't conflicting. So right now I'm thinking, the original argument did seem to create an actual conflict between answering all questions truthfully and keeping all promises, which would include promises to keep a secret. Whereas here, I'm like, these things seem like they could overlap. So I would keep reading. Some politicians could attain popularity with voters only by making extravagant promises. This, however, would deceive the people. So since the only way for some politicians to be popular is to deceive, and any politician needs to be popular, it follows that some politicians must deceive. That conclusion seems valid, but it seems to be a very different type of reasoning. In fact, it's not about obligations, it's just talking about what in fact is going to happen. So one way to think about this is that the conclusion in the original argument isn't about what is or is not going to happen. It's about your obligation, right? One cannot be obliged to do these two things. Whether or not you do them or not, it's almost like another matter. This is just about some politicians, and it's saying they will deceive, not saying whether they're obliged to deceive or things like that. So, I mean, I think it's different for other reasons, but it also is just different for that. C, if we put a lot of effort into making this report look good, the client might think we did so because we believed our proposal would not stand on its own merits. On the other hand, if we do not try to make the report look good, the client might think we are not serious about our business. So whatever we do, we risk her criticism. Okay. I feel like there's actually a middle ground here. It says, if we put a lot of effort into making this report look good, if we do not try to make the report look good, what about trying but not putting in a lot of effort? That's a middle ground, right? So this argument is flawed. I would say it's out because the original was not flawed. It also just, I mean, it seems different because we're not talking about obligations or things conflicting in that way. D, if creditors have legitimate claims against a business and the business has the resources to pay those debts, then the business is obliged to pay them. Okay. Also, if a business has obligations to pay debts, then a court will force it to pay them. There's a lot going on here, but the courts did not force this business to pay its debt. So either the creditors did not have the legitimate claims or the business did not have sufficient resources. Okay, that might be a legit argument, but it's definitely a different kind of reasoning. It's like, oh, if A, then B, B didn't happen, therefore A could not have happened, as opposed to having these two situations that conflict with each other. So we could dig into this more, but I'm just going to say, no, it's not the same. E, if we extend our business hours, we will either have to hire new employees or have existing employees work overtime. Okay, we have these two options, but both new employees and additional employees would dramatically increase our labor costs. We cannot afford to increase our labor costs, so we will have to keep our business hours as they stand. That's a legitimate argument, but again, it's very different, right? It's like if we go down this path, then we're going to have a problem that we cannot resolve. Therefore, we can't go down that path. It's not, again, these two like conflicting obligations. I just don't see it at all. So I would go back to A, and despite my concern with the word right versus duty, I would pick it because we have the two conflicting duties on some level. You guys, I don't mean to muddy the waters by saying I have reservations about A, but I think it's 100% correct because it's the best by far. Questions? Brittany?
Can you go back through how I think it was answer D isn't the answer? Because I saw at the very end, I probably just like read it wrong, but I saw at the very end that there were two conflicting things. So either they didn't have legitimate claims or they didn't have the sufficient resources. So to me, it kind of seemed like it was doing like either or, kind of like the question was.
Well, so the original question is actually saying one cannot be obliged to do two things, right? You can't be obliged to do both of these things because it will create a conflict, right? If you do one, then you're going to violate the other. This last one, D is just saying, so, hey, either of these two outcomes, it actually says or. So either the creditors did not have legitimate claims or the business did not have sufficient resources. It's not saying that these things conflict. It's just saying it must be the case that one of these things is true. That's all it's saying.
Okay.
It's not saying that there's like Like if you do one of those things, then the other one couldn't happen. In fact, maybe both of those things are true.
Okay.
Okay, is that, you feel good about that?
Yeah, no, that clears it up. Thank you.
Yep, Yana.
Hi. Okay, so I chose A. I read A and I was like, yes. I went with it and I didn't go through the other ones. And the reason I did that, and I don't,
Yeah.
this might be like a mental thing and maybe you won't be able to like have an answer for it.
Sure.
So for me, A was so, I guess, easy, like, oh, this has to be it. If I would have gone through the other ones, I would have convinced myself that A is not the answer because it's too easy. And I would have like found reasons why the one of the other ones that's harder is the answer. And I do that a lot with these types of questions.
Okay, well,
I don't know if that happens, but it's like a second guessing thing.
well, that's like a weird, like, so you have this like presumption that an answer choice has to be difficult. Maybe because it's parallel reasoning?
I don't know, maybe it's just because it's the LSAT, and I just feel like it's just trying to screw me over.
Okay, so maybe one way you can start saying to yourself, because you actually want to believe it, is
Yeah.
that these answers, they make sense. Like there's a reason that these answers, even the answers that are correct but have problems, still are 100% correct because they are totally better than some, next answer that you might be tempted about. And once you may not see that right away, and you may need like to read the explanation or unpack it, but once you see that, you're like, oh, okay, that's hands down better. So I can see why that's the best answer, even if it's not a perfect answer. So I'd rather you like start owning the test, almost like a test writer in the sense, and you're going through these answers, you're like, nope, that's bad for this reason, and feeling good about the correct answer because it makes sense. And like you almost want to get to a point where the correct answers all seem easy. Like you're like, yeah, that fits. So maybe you're almost like avoiding a
Yeah.
potential area where you could improve, right?
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yep. Joshua.
Yeah, so with the last question we did, I was stuck between A and C, and I ultimately chose A, one, due to the obligation of it, and secondly, because C felt like it was a really specific case. Like I didn't come to the whole try and effort thing that you did. And I want to know, is that okay or not? Because it felt like in the argument, A was like a general principle or idea, and then when you looked at C, was more about in this one specific instance in a business.
Yeah, I agree. The original is a more general claim, right? It's just talking about one, as in people in general, right? Cannot do these two things. Whereas this is about this particular person. But I think if answer choice C was talking about obligations to this person, and the obligations were conflicting. In other words, you couldn't have both obligations without if you do one, you're going to violate the other. I could see that being the correct answer, assuming A didn't exist. I mean, again, it would really be a comparison of which one's better, but I wouldn't get rid of it because I'd be like, oh, well, they're only talking about obligations to this one client, and that's too narrow. To me, that doesn't seem like fundamental to this reasoning. What's really fundamental here is that you can't have two obligations that would create a problem in other words, if you did one, you'd violate the other.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep. Cool. All right. Let's go ahead and do the next three. Okay, so good luck, and then we'll go over this. All right, guys, how many people are done? Okay, let's go ahead. Looks like enough of us, maybe. So go ahead and fill out that survey for the first question, 1970s. Let's take a look here. Okay. Test 65, section 4, question 17. Watching music videos from the 1970s would give the viewer the impression that the music of the time was dominated by synthesizer pop and punk rock. Okay, so if you watch videos from the 1970s, you'd get this impression, right? All right. But this would be a misleading impression. That almost certainly is the conclusion. This is not right. Why? Because music videos were a new art form at the time. They attracted primarily cutting edge musicians. All right. I actually, I sympathize with this argument. It doesn't seem invalid, right? Like the conclusion is just, hey, this action, looking at these videos would be misleading. Why would it be misleading? Because the people who created them were cutting edge musicians, not musicians in general. So yeah, it seems like it's pretty likely that it would be misleading. All right, so I'd say this is pretty valid. Which one of the following arguments is most similar in its reasoning to that of the argument above? And this question doesn't use the word flaw in the question, so it kind of confirms that we're probably on the right path. A, our view of pre-printing press literature can never be accurate because the surviving works of ancient authors are those that were deemed by copyists most likely to be of interest to future readers. Okay, I feel like this argument is kind of similar in the sense that we have a factor in the past that's creating sort of a bias in the work that you end up seeing, right? Like these videos were created primarily by cutting edge musicians. Well, in this case, it's a little different. You have copyists, but they're choosing what works to put into the literature. And so it kind of makes sense. I would keep this open because it seems similar. I'm a little hesitant about the fact that the conclusion is our view of pre-printing press literature can never be accurate, right? I feel like there's a similar kind of reasoning going on here, but this conclusion is a lot stronger than saying, hey, look, if you look at a few videos from the 1970s, you're going to get a misleading impression. That's not saying that we can never figure it out. A is saying we can never figure it out. So, I'd probably keep this one open, but be a little bit hesitant. B, our memory of the 1960s TV shows could hardly be improved. That's weird, our memory. Because so many of the television programs of the era are still rerun today. This is not, okay, this has nothing to do with like a biased sample or a misleading sample. It's just like, hey, you're still seeing them today. C, future generations' understanding of today's publishing trends will be distorted if they judge works published in CD-ROM format, since it is primarily publishers interested in computer games that are using CD-ROM. Wow, this is a dated question. But in any case, if it's primarily publishers interested in computer games that are using CD-ROM, then if you judge works by looking at CD-ROM formats or CD-ROM, whatever, then yeah, you're going to get a distorted or misleading impression. This argument seems very similar. And I like the fact now that I'm thinking about A and I'm thinking about C, answer choice C talks about people doing a particular thing. It says, if they judge by works published in CD-ROM format, that is almost exactly the same as watching music videos from the 1970s, right? You don't have to watch music videos from the 1970s to judge the music of the 1970s. You could listen to vinyl or CDs or whatever. Like, you could look at a whole bunch of other things, right? So in answer choice A, it was just like, hey, we can never figure this out. They didn't tell you how we would look at pre-printing press literature. It's just like, it's a closed door. It's over. Where this answer choice and the original were more about like, if you look at these things in this particular way, then it's likely to be misleading or distorted, which means the same thing to me. Why? Because you have this biased group or a biased sample, right? So C is almost certainly correct. And it looks like that's what almost all of you picked. D, our understanding of silent films is incomplete because few filmmakers of the time realized that the film stock they were using would disintegrate over time. Answer choice D is kind of the same as A. It's like, we can't figure it out. We can't figure it out because the films just aren't around, right? It's not doing what C and the original are doing, inviting you to look at silent films through a particular medium, such as watching videos or looking at CD-ROM. Okay, E, so D is wrong. E, our notion of fashion trends will probably be accurate. Well, that's weird. We're looking for something that says not accurate, probably. If we rely on TV fashion programs, despite the fact these programs deliberately select the most outrageous outfits. Okay, this is horrible. It's basically saying the opposite of what it should be saying, right? It's like conceding that the sample is biased, but then saying it should be accurate. That's weird. I see a decent number of us were tempted by E though. I think you got turned around because E is, the original argument was valid, or at least mostly valid. E is not valid. It's like, hey, these things are outrageous, but it'll still give us a good sense of what fashion trends are. That's not good. That's a bad argument. Okay, questions? I hope silence is a good thing. That means we're all good. Okay. Let's go to the next one. This is question 20, I believe. Test J, section 3, question 20. We should accept the proposal to demolish the old train station because the local historical society, which vehemently opposes this, is dominated by people who have no commitment to long-term economic well-being. All right, right there we have a problem. You're basically saying we shouldn't do something because someone else is opposed to this, and I don't like their reasons for being opposed. If I'm opposed to you driving without a seatbelt because I believe it's gonna lead to ghosts entering your house. That's pretty stupid. But would you disagree with my conclusion that you should wear a seatbelt? Because I think if you don't, you're going to get ghosts in your house. You'd probably be like, well, that guy's an idiot, but I agree with his conclusion because, yeah, wearing seatbelts is smart. I don't want to die. Has nothing to do with the ghosts. So here it's saying we should demolish this building, right? Because these other people who are opposed to demolishing it have bad reasons for being opposed. They may have bad reasons, but that doesn't mean that their conclusion sucks. Maybe they're still right that it should not be demolished. Now this last sentence, preserving old buildings creates an impediment to new development, which is critical to economic health. If economic health is important, and this argument never says that it is, but if it is important, then that might be a reason to demolish the building. So this part of the argument is okay in my mind, but this first part is horrible. You can't you can't go against someone merely because they have a bad reason for their conclusion. The flawed reasoning exhibited by the argument above is most similar to that exhibited by which one of the following arguments. I fully expect the correct answer to do something similar. Someone is going to say, hey, we should do X for a certain reason. The author of the argument is going to hate that reason and therefore say we should not do X, right? Or the opposite of whatever the person said. So let's take a look. A, our country should attempt to safeguard works of art that it deems to possess national cultural significance. Okay, we should do this thing. Okay, these works might not be recognized as such by all taxpayers or even all critics. Nevertheless, our country ought to expend whatever money is needed to procure all such works as they become available. It looks like a lot of us were tempted by this. It does introduce critics and their thoughts, but not very much. It doesn't say, hey, we should do this because these people are opposed for bad reasons. It just says there are some people who are opposed. It doesn't say why they're opposed. It doesn't say that their opposition is for bad reasons. It just says, oh, they're opposed. And so this argument is not making the same mistake that the original made by going against somebody merely because you don't like their reasoning. B, in A, they just don't even give reasoning at all, right? The critics' reasoning is not mentioned at all. B, documents of importance to local heritage should be properly preserved and archived for the sake of future generations. 4, okay, now we're getting into the premise. If even one of these documents is damaged or lost, the integrity of the historical record as a whole will be damaged. I'm reading this quickly because until I see anything about what other people think and why those reasons are bad, it's not going to be the answer. Okay. C, you should have your haircut no more than once a month. After all, beauticians suggest that their customers have their haircut twice a month, and they do this as a way of generating more business for themselves. Okay, so here's someone suggesting something opposite of what you're concluding, and you don't like the reason that they're suggesting it. That doesn't make their suggestion wrong. So they could be wrong. I'm not saying they're right. It's just that's not a good enough reason, and it's the same mistake as the original. So that's the answer. D, the committee should endorse the plan to postpone construction of the new expressway. Many residents of the neighborhoods that would be affected are fervently opposed to that construction. All right, so there is some opposition. Now I need the argument to say that the opposition's reasoning sucks, but instead it says, and the committee is obligated to avoid alienating those residents. If you're obligated to avoid alienating those residents, then yeah, you should probably endorse the plan to postpone the construction of the new expressway if that's what they want. This argument makes sense. It's not flawed in the way that the other is flawed. It doesn't talk about the residents' reasoning or say that their reasoning is bad. It just says, in fact, something else. You should do what they say. You should do whatever will make them happy. So this is not flawed and thus wrong. E, one should not borrow even small amounts of money unless it is absolutely necessary. Once one borrows a few dollars, the interest starts to accumulate. The longer one takes to repay, the more one ends up owing, and eventually a small debt has become a large one. No mention of other people and their opinions and then their reasoning. So that's out. Questions on this one? Okay. So when you see the flaw in the original argument, that's the answer, right? And when you see that it's valid, then you're also know where the answer is going to be. It's going to be in a valid argument. Last one. Test 65, section 4, question 24. Paleomycologists. Paleomycologists. I actually don't know what they are, but it looks like it's going to tell us. Scientists who study ancient forms of fungi are invariably acquainted with the scholarly publications of all other paleomycologists. Okay, so whenever I see the word invariably on the test, I just replace it with the word always, because that's what it means and that's an easier word, right? So these folks, these scientists are always acquainted with the scholarly publications of all other paleomycologists. That's a pretty incredible claim. But if it's a premise, I just have to accept it as true. Essentially, these folks know each other's works and they know all of them. There's no exception, right? I find that to be a crazy claim because that just seems like a lot of things to know, but maybe there aren't that many paleomycologists. Professor Mansour is acquainted with the scholarly publications of Professor DeAngelis, who is a paleomycologist. Okay, so this guy knows these scholarly publications of this other guy. Therefore, Professor Mansour must also be a paleomycologist. This is the LSAT's favorite flaw, right? It's saying, if you're a paleomycologist, then you're going to know all these scholarly works. This one professor, Professor Mansour, knows the scholarly works of at least one paleomycologist. Therefore, Professor Mansour must also be a paleomycologist. So we took a condition that was sufficient. If you're a paleomycologist, then you have to have this certain condition. You must know the works. And then we treated it as if it were a necessary condition. We said, oh, if you know the works, then you must be a paleomycologist. Do you guys see how that went backwards? Confuse a sufficient condition for a necessary condition. So if at this point, you probably would know it's a parallel reasoning question because the answer choices are so long, but it could just as easily be a regular flaw question. And the correct answer would be something like the argument confuses what is necessary for paleomycologists with what is sufficient for paleomycologists, or something like that. But anyways, it says the flawed pattern of reasoning in the argument above is most similar to which one of the following arguments? Okay, so I'm going to expect it to do something similar. If you are A, then you are B. This person is a little bit like B, so they must be A. I'm saying a little bit like B. Do you guys see how the original just said Professor Mansour is a little bit like B? Didn't say that Professor Mansour is B, because Professor Mansour doesn't necessarily know the scholarly publications of all paleomycologists, just knows the ones from Professor DeAngelis, right? So it's not even, at this point, we don't even know if Professor Mansour is like all paleomycologists who happen to know all the works of all other paleomycologists. So this is a pretty bad argument. But fundamentally, it's like if A, then B, this person is kind of like B or a little bit like B, therefore they must be A. Answer choice A. When a flight on Global Airlines is delayed, all connecting Global Airlines flights are also delayed so that the passengers can make their connections. Okay, so if delayed, then connecting are delayed. Since Frida's connecting flight on Global was delayed, her first flight must have also been delayed. This is doing the exact same thing. If your first flight is delayed, your connecting flight is delayed, her connecting flight was delayed, therefore her first flight must have been delayed. That's going backwards. It's treating what is necessary as if it were sufficient. So that's probably the answer, and it looks like it's the most popular one. B, anytime that one of Global Airlines' local ticket agents misses a shift, the other agents on that shift need to work harder. Okay, so if somebody misses, then you work harder. Since none of Global's local ticket agents missed a shift last week, no one missed, the airline's local ticket agents did not have to work harder than usual. Okay, that argument is actually flawed for a very similar reason as the original. But I think when you look at A and you look at B, you can feel how they're different in the sense that the original was like, if you have characteristic A, then you have characteristic B. Professor Mansour is kind of like B, therefore Professor Mansour is A. Answer choice B here says, if you miss a shift, then you have to work harder. No one missed a shift, so no one worked harder, right? It's a very similar kind of flaw, but can you guys sense how we're negating the stuff as opposed to going backwards? Does that kind of make sense? That's why A is better than B, although if A didn't exist, B would work because it's still confusing a sufficient condition for a necessary one. It's just doing it slightly differently. But no one seemed to be tempted by that. So I guess the negation protected you. C, anytime the price of fuel decreases, okay, if it decreases, global airlines expenses decrease and its income is unaffected. If the fuel price decreases, then these other two things happen. If you got rid of this answer choice because in this first sentence, two things happen, you got rid of it for the wrong reason. That doesn't matter. The fact that it's like, if this one thing happens, then these other two things happen is irrelevant. That's not fundamental to the underlying reasoning, right? What I really care about is if something happens, then something else is going to happen. This other thing or two things happened, therefore the first thing must have happened. We want to avoid that kind of flaw, and that can still happen in answer choice C. Answer choice C continues. The price of fuel decreased several times last year. Ooh. This is now I can say this is wrong, because it was like, if this first thing happens, then these other two things are going to happen. And by the way, the first thing did happen. That's a totally different kind of reasoning. You guys okay with that? So I'm going to move on. I'm just curious though, is it valid? Therefore, global airlines must have made a profit last year. I still don't know. It says, well, because if it decreased several times, yeah, maybe they made more money in that time at that time, but maybe there were other times that year where they lost money. So I don't know if that's even a valid argument. But D, all employees of global airlines can participate in its retirement plan after they have been with the company a year or more. So if you've been there a year or more, then you can participate. Galvin has been with global airlines for 3 years. Okay, I'm done with this. This is actually, answer choices D and C are exactly the same. Whoa, I see a lot of people were tempted by D. So I guess we're gonna have to read further, but D is wrong because notice what it's doing. It's like, if you've been here for a year or more, then you can do this other thing. And then it's like, Galvin has been here for 3 years. It's going back to the first idea. To be parallel to the original argument, it needs to go to the second idea, right? In the original argument, it was like, if you're a paleomycologist, then you know all these other works. This guy kind of knows there's some works, therefore he must be a paleomycologist. It's going backwards. Answer choice D, it's like, if you've been here a long time, then you can participate. Galvin has been here a long time. We can therefore be sure that he participates in Global's retirement plan. Well, that argument is flawed, but it's flawed for a different reason. Just because you can participate doesn't mean that you will, but that's a much different flaw than confusing sufficient for necessary. We good with that? So yes, D is flawed, but it's simply going from what you can do to what you will do. And that's where it's flawed. Thus, it's not parallel and it's wrong. E, whenever a competitor of global airlines reduces its fares, Global must follow suit or lose passengers. Global carried more passengers last year than it did the year before. Therefore, Global must have reduced its fares last year to match reductions in its competitors' fares. Okay, that actually kind of makes sense. Again, here it's not going from A to B and then from B back to A. It's actually saying, look, we carried more passengers, so we must not have lost them. It's negating that second idea. So this is not parallel and this is wrong. All right, I can see this is a level 5 question. I can see that some of us were tempted by D and E, I guess. Questions? Yes. Go ahead, Don.
Oh, hey, Ben. So I was actually contemplating between A and D, and I wasn't really sure about what your explanation on D was and why it was wrong. So is it okay if you could explain it to me one more time?
Yeah. So basically, D is saying if you've been there a long time, then you can participate in the retirement plan. Are you cool with that? And then the argument says Galvin has been there a long time. Therefore, and what it should say is therefore he can participate. That would be a valid argument. The original was not valid because it went backwards. To make answer choice D like the original, it would have to say something like, if you've been here for a long time, then you can participate in the retirement plan. Galvin participates in the retirement plan. Therefore, he must have been there a long time.
Okay.
That would be going backwards, and that would be similar. That would be a similar flaw to the flaw we saw in the original argument.
Okay, so it's wrong because it's taking the flaw that was originally, it's shifting, it's like you said, it's backwards.
So it's actually fixing the flaw. It's not exhibiting the flaw. It is a flawed argument. So I don't want, but we have to separate the reason it's flawed from the reason that it's valid. So the original argument went backwards. It confused a sufficient condition for a necessary condition. It shouldn't have done that. But answer choice D doesn't do that.
Doesn't do that. Okay.
Yeah, it's like, hey, if you've been here a long time, you can participate. Oh, Galvin has been here a long time. Therefore, and then what it should say is he can participate. Its mistake was, though, is it said he must be participating. So D is flawed, but it's flawed for a much different reason. The original argument was like, hey, if you've been here a long time, then you can participate. This person is participating, so they must have been here a long time. And that's not necessarily true. Maybe you're also an executive, and executives can participate right away. Who knows?
I see. Okay,
cool.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it.
Kimberly. Yeah, of course. By the way, it's already 7:34. I'm sorry if you guys need to take off. You're welcome to leave, but I will keep taking questions, especially on this one, and then I'll take open questions after that. So don't feel obligated to stay. Kimberly?
Yeah, hi, Ben. So on D, I think the reason that I got tripped up was because I read it as, for some reason, I switched the sufficient and necessary, and I thought it was saying that if you're participating in the retirement plan, then you've been with the company a year or more. Then when you kind of explained it, I was like, okay, well, then they didn't make the flaw that the original argument.
So what can happen here is sometimes the sentence says, right, all employees of global airlines can participate in its retirement plan after they have been with the company for a year or more. So the participate word comes earlier in the sentence than the whole a year or more sort of thing, right? But the reality is that you have to think about what the sentence is saying, and what it's saying, and the subject of the sentence is all employees of global airlines. So if you're an employee of global airlines, what can you do? Oh, you can participate in its retirement plan. When? After you've been with a company a year or more. So really what it's saying is if you've been here a year or more, then you can participate. And it's one of the challenges with diagramming almost, because it's like you look at the sentence and then you just kind of take something that's near the beginning of the sentence and something that's near the end, and you think of that as being the if clause and the then clause. But really you kind of want to step back and just think, okay, what does this mean? Who does what?
Right. Yeah, and then I read it over again, and I kind of saw that second flaw that you mentioned about like can, and saying that Gavin must be in the retirement plan.
Yeah,
And I kind of realized that there was another reason why this was the wrong answer. But
yes. Yeah, it's just like a different flaw, right? It's flawed, but flawed for a different reason.
right. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, Yana.
Okay, I just want to clarify because I chose A, but after your explanation, I feel like I chose it for the wrong reason. So when I read the passage, the first thing that I found issue with was I thought to myself, I said, well, maybe the professor is not a paleomycologist. He's just interested in the work.
Sure, that's exactly right. That's what's wrong with confusing sufficient for necessary.
Right. And then the reason I chose A is because, again, when I read the conclusion saying that her first flight must have been delayed, I said, no, well, she could have made that flight and now someone else's flight's delayed. Therefore, all of the other flights are delayed.
That's 100% right. So your thinking is correct. Just keep in mind, though, that the same reasoning you use there should apply to answer choice B as well. In answer choice B, anytime someone misses a shift, the other people need to work harder. No one missed a shift, therefore no one had to work harder. No, there could be other reasons that they have to work harder, right? So that's why this question in particular is a little tough, because both answer choices A and B suffer from the same flaw, which you saw. It's just that
I got lucky and I chose A.
Yeah, like the way that this is tough. That's probably why this is a level 5 question. Although it's interesting because no one really, not that many people were tempted by B. So that's not the hang up, it seems to be. But yeah, your thought process is correct, right? That is why it is correct.
Okay.
Cool. Alex.
Yeah, I was tempted by B and I was stuck. I couldn't see. So when I read the first sentence of B, I saw it as missing a shift was sufficient to trigger working harder. Is that wrong?
Wait, say that again. Sorry.
When I read it, the first sentence of answer B, I read it as missing a shift was sufficient to trigger working harder than usual. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly right. So any time that the local ticket agents misses a shift, so that whole thing is the sufficient condition. That's what guarantees, or the necessary condition is that people will have to work harder.
Because I'm trying to figure out like what it does differently. Because like I get what you mean when like you feel like A does something a little different, and I feel like Yana, I think, yeah, like Yana, like I lucked out with A because I just kind of went with it because it felt right. But like after that sufficient setup, it does, like if I imagine it in my head, like if M then W, and then in the second sentence it's like since no M then no W, but that's not exactly like, is that still the necessary sufficient flaw?
Yeah, that's challenging and probably maybe a little bit mildly flawed about this question, is that both A and B are struggling with confusing sufficient for necessary. It's just that the way in which A does it is closer to the way in which the original did it by affirming the necessary condition as opposed to negating the sufficient condition.
Okay, I like that. That makes sense to me. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So basically that's what the original did and that's what A did. They're like, oh, this thing is true about this person, therefore this other thing must be true. Whereas in B, it's like, this thing is not true about the sufficient condition, therefore the necessary condition must not be true. That's just as flawed, but it's kind of like a different way of getting to the same mountaintop, I guess you could say.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, Joshua.
Yeah, I had a question about the sufficient and necessary and the way they appear on the test. So the thing I feel like I noticed, I could be wrong about this, is that sometimes I feel like I'll read an argument that has a sufficient and necessary condition, and I'll stop and like make sure I understand that. And then as I go into the question, it doesn't have anything to do with it being sufficient or necessary. Like it was just there, but it didn't really use it. Does that like happen?
Yeah, that definitely happens. So anytime, so sufficient necessary conditions appear throughout the test, right? They don't have to be just in if then form. We see actually a ton of them right here, not in if then form, right? When it says paleomycologists are invariably or always acquainted, what that essentially means is if, it doesn't say if, but if you're a paleomycologist, then you are acquainted with all these works, right? And then same with any and when and any and all these answer choices. They're introducing essentially if then statements, which are essentially statements that have a sufficient condition and a necessary condition. If the argument gives you a sentence that has a sufficient condition and a necessary condition in it, and the way this works, by the way, is you either have both or you don't have either one. So that's the nature of a conditional statement. But if the sentence has that, and then the argument proceeds to use that conditional statement correctly, then we don't care about that. Who cares, right? Like it's like, oh, okay, great, like nice. I mean, in a parallel reasoning question, not a parallel flaw question, I guess we care about that in the sense that the correct answer is probably going to do the same thing. It's going to have a sentence or a premise that has a sufficient and necessary condition. It's going to use it correctly. But other than that, in most cases, like in non-parallel reasoning questions, if it uses it correctly, well, then that's not why it's flawed if it's flawed. And if it's not flawed, then they're probably asking you something else, like what must be true or, you know, whatever.
Yeah, no, I was realizing that. And I was just sitting there doing some of those questions. I'm like, I made sure I understood the sufficient necessary condition. And then I went into the question. I was like, I just wasted time. So yeah, it was like one of those things where it was just like, oh, I'm eating up my time trying to figure this out, but it wasn't even used.
Well,
so I just want to make sure I wasn't going crazy.
I don't know if you're wasting your time necessarily. I mean, I am like, maybe you're wasting your time if you're just like unnecessarily translating it into an if-then statement. But ideally, you get to a point where most of these conditional statements, you read them and they are something that you could convert in your head, not on paper, in your head to an if-then statement back and forth. You can just go back and forth. Like when I ask people, do you understand the argument? And they start reciting to me verbatim the words that they see on the page, my gut says, maybe you don't it's not really in there. It's not been internalized, right? You're still like kind of relying on the wording that has been given to you. But if you read this first sentence and you step back and you're like, okay, so these guys invariably know about the works of everyone else. Essentially what it's saying is if you're one of these folks, then you must know all these works. We're not converting it into if then just for kicks and giggles. We're doing that because it's an easy way to communicate, right? And so hopefully it's something where you can go into an if then format and then back out again and back and forth, just because there are different ways of saying the same thing. And you understand, and now that means you can restate things in your own words more clearly. That's all.
Gotcha. That was super helpful. Thank you.
Yep. Cool. Any other questions on this question? If not, we can go on to other questions. Okay. I'm happy to answer a couple more questions. Abigail, Christine, I know you guys might need to take off. I don't know. If you need to, you're welcome to. All right. Yes, Don.
All right. So when you gave us like 6 or 7 minutes to answer these 3 questions, like I felt myself kind of just rushing through each question.
Yeah.
Like I kind of thought about it. Oh, I only have 6 minutes. I need to spend at least, or at the most, 2 minutes and maybe like 30 seconds on, or 15 seconds on each one. And if I go past that, like I'm screwed because I'm not going to be able to answer then like the last 3 questions. So I was just wondering, like maybe I'm not like used to LSAT time taking tests yet. Do you think that by always doing like time sections and practice tests and doing all of that, that this feeling is just going to go away, or I'm just going to get used to it? Or
I think it can go away, but I think it's more likely to go away if you deliberately decide that you're going to do a time section and you're not going to worry about finishing. In other words, if your metric for success is at all tied to how many questions you do in the time that you have, then you're going to be pulled away and it's going to be hard for you to get rid of that feeling, right? And tonight, I said, hey, I'll give you 6 minutes to do these questions. You have to then immediately say, I don't give a fuck about how many questions I do. If Ben ends in 6 minutes and I'm not done, that's okay. That's not my measure of success. My measure of success is how well I did on the ones I got to. And so if you can let go of that, and you just have to consciously keep trying to do that, then hopefully that feeling can go away very quickly, right? It's like your next time you do a time section, you're like, okay, my goal here is to get 100% on the questions I type. So if you do 5 questions and you got 100%, then bam, you won. And yeah, granted, we need to get to more than 5 questions, but if you can do that, then that's a good start. And now you can shoot for 6 out of 6 and 7 out of 7. That's why we actually have the accuracy score in the new daemon, so that you can focus on that instead of your actual raw score.
Okay. All right. I'll keep working on that then. Thank you.
Just keep trying and have the timer going, and then just be like, okay, I just don't worry about that. My job in any given moment is to do the question. And I would say even more specifically, it's to do the sentence that you're on. You don't have any other obligations. Just understand the sentence you're working on. Then you can work on the next sentence. And
Okay.
you just work, and then the timer's up, and then you're just done. And you got as far as you could get.
Okay. All right. Appreciate it, Ben.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Any other questions before we check out? All right, guys. Thank you so much. Have a good night. If you have any feedback, email me, ben@lsatdemon.com. I'll try to make this class as best as I can, and it helps to hear what you guys think. So thank you.